Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. I'm Gary Pollan from the right.
I'm David Jones, and I'm to your left.
This week we're going to talk about the state of education, a very important issue with three important guests. First, A.D. Chambers, Superintendent, Alief Independent School District. Welcome, sir. Carol Shattuck, Executive Director, Collaborative for Children. We're going to find out what that is. Andy Canales, Director, Center for Social Measurement and Evaluation, Children at Risk. And we're not going to talk about David's experience on your board.
Thank you.
David?
I had a wonderful time. Superintendent, may I call you Superintendent?
You can call me whatever you like. I go by a lot of things.
You were quoted in the only newspaper of record that we have. You know, Gary reads the Bel Air Register, I think it's called. I'm not sure. And anyway, it said that Texas had, the investigative report said Texas had illegally excluded students from special education classes. They'd done so for years, since 2004. There were 150,000 kids that lost their opportunities for being in special education classes. You were quoted as saying that we, meaning your school district, weren't derelict. The state of Texas was derelict. The Texas Education Agency was derelict. And also the president of the Texas School Alliance, an advocacy group, echoed your remarks. So what went wrong, and has it been fixed?
No, it has not been fixed. What went wrong, in my estimation, is at a point in time in the early you could go back to the late 90s, but in the early 2000s, there was a concern about the number of students being identified with special ed services in Texas, or across the country for that matter, but for this discussion for Texas. And there was a what I consider to be an arbitrary percent placed as a cap for districts, schools to follow, so to make sure that a certain percent of your student population wasn't identified, so that they were, and two reasons for that. One, there was a financial reason.
They save some money by doing so.
It's extremely expensive to educate children with special needs. Mm-hmm. Just a fact.
Yeah.
But the other part of it was there was a concern that there was being over-identification of students, that schools were over-identifying them for a variety of different reasons.
Do they get extra money for special education students?
Yes, we get extra money, but I will assure you the additional funds that we receive are not nearly enough to cover the cost of providing the services that those children need. Where I think it went wrong, if you will, is this cap became a part of an expectation and a compliance measure that the state of Texas placed on schools. And you can go back to 2004 and look at this compliance document that was used to measure schools, and it looked at what percent of your student population was receiving special ed services. And if it exceeded 8.5%, there were consequences. There were things that would happen. So we, educators, we began trying to do everything we could do to reduce that number, so we were in compliance with what the state of Texas expected out of us.
And what I read also was that this was in clear violation of federal law on this with this setting a standard and leaving certain people out, that the U.S. Department of Education declared that it was a violation of federal law.
Yeah, there's very well documented case law at the federal level that basically says you can't set an arbitrary cap on the number of students or the percentage of students who are either qualifying and or receiving the services. So yeah, we felt, and the quotes I was quoted in this publication were based upon my experiences. I recall having conversations about this cap and were we going to make decisions on a child in his or her best interest and be in violation of this cap, or were we going to have to be in compliance with the cap and in some cases not do right by the students' needs? That's where the feds began saying, okay, well, we had a certain number of students who were not being serviced, and that's true. That I don't know what the number is.
Well, it said 150,000.
Right. Maybe that's. I mean, I don't in no position to argue whether
not
it's
in your
150.
district.
Not in Alief.
No.
Across the state of Texas. And as I said this, I'm not only speaking for Alief ISD. I think I'm speaking for most educators across the state of Texas and across the country that was dealing with this issue during that time and have continued to deal with it up until this most recent controversy.
You would agree with maybe agree with me that if there's a financial incentive, arguably to label children that they have special needs when they're marginal or don't, that some unscrupulous people will decide to label more so they get more money. And I understand the way you describe how you do special ed, the extra money you get doesn't pay for it. But I'm certain there are districts in the state where that is not the case. I mean, one of the things I read about is that the districts are not spending the appropriate amount of money or have the right teachers or educating these kids who do have special needs. And I happen to be an expert on it because I have an adult child who had special needs, and he was in public education for 3 years. And then it was train wreck in HISD because he was basically being warehoused in year 3 with a terrible teacher, and it didn't get better. So, I mean, our problem. And so one of the things I wanted to mention, wouldn't it be easier for the districts, because look, your sweet spot probably, and y'all can chime in on this, is educating the normal students and the gifted students. Probably your sweet spot. Is that fair? Y'all are good at that?
Yeah, but I would also, I would add to that, we have found, public ed in general has found a way to educate some of the most challenging students over the last 2 or 3 decades. So I don't know if sweet spot's the right adjective or the right term to use, but I would say that we have people that are passionate and who have gained skills in working with some of the most challenging students who used to not be dealt with in the public school system. And
Yeah,
so,
I guess that was kind of my experience. Okay.
Well, there's a
Other
question
guests.
that these...
We have other guests.
Yeah, we have other guests. The Chronicle had an editorial that said that we were an embarrassment, the state of Texas was, as far as education goes, because 1 out of 6 were not making it through high school. And I don't know what amount of time this number accrued to be 3 million kids who knows if they'll ever be adults, if you drop out of high school. So what is it that you think is going on that contributes to that high rate of dropout? And then, Mr. Chambers, you could tell us how your district is doing as far as getting kids ready for career and college.
Well, that's 2 questions.
Yeah,
Andy,
that's 2
why don't you go first with the first question?
Sure. Well, I think overall we have to ask the broader question that when we see that Texas is number 43 in per pupil funding in education, are we doing all that we can to adequately support all of our students, special education students? But when we talk about the average student, the general student, 60% of the students in our state educational system, 5 million students, are economically disadvantaged. So we teachers need the resources to adequately support our children. And part of the feedback that we hear from teachers and from school districts is that they don't have the resources or the funding to do that. That is why you see some of those statistics, including that only 20% of students are graduating college ready. For low income students, that is less than 10%. So I think we have to ask this question and demand more from our local representatives that are funding our schools.
And I think the way I would respond is that education starts a lot earlier than pre-K or K. And so what we have...
You mean in the womb?
Well, that too, in terms of being familiar with a mother's
Yeah.
voice, but really once the child is born, those first 3 years are when most of the neurons in a child's brain get connected or not, based on the interaction that they receive from other adults in their life. And so when that interaction with other adults is positive and nurturing, and that child has an opportunity to hear language, to learn to speak, to be read to, then they are in a much different place than a child that is in a home, either parents working in a home watching television most of the day. So we've got a child care system that for many is unaffordable because they're businesses for the most part.
By the way, watching television doesn't seem to hurt the president.
I won't respond to that. But I think what we know now, and this has been 20, 30 years of research now, is that these early years from 0 to 5 are some of the most critical years in a child's life.
And the teachers who teach 0 to 5 are the lowest paid teachers in the system.
They're the lowest
according to the New York
paid,
Times Magazine Sunday.
And according to our state criteria, they're required to have a high school diploma or a GED. So one of the roles that Collaborative for Children has is trying to close that gap between what a child care teacher enters with in terms of their formal education and what they need to be an effective teacher in an early childhood classroom.
Well, that's quite fascinating.
Well, let's go back to, what was my second question, which
Yeah,
was
for the
ruled out of
superintendent.
order, correct
Yeah,
ruling.
premature.
Correct ruling. You have a job of getting kids ready for college or a career. I mean, and with 1 out of 6, I'm not saying it's 1 out of 6 that is dropping out in Alief, but is there any special attention made for, getting those kids ready for college? And what is the admission rate for kids coming out of Alief ISD for college?
Right. Couple things. The report you're referring to, the Houston Endowment did it. And it was a very longitudinal study about 8th graders. X number of years after they graduate high school, where are they? And you're right, the numbers were less than we're less than proud of them, to say the least. The things that have occurred over the last, in my opinion, the last 3 to 5 years that are beginning to move to try to address this have to do with trying to engage kids more in their high school experience. And every one of us sitting at this table, regardless of our age, regardless of when we were in high school, probably took a curriculum that was prescriptive, it was strict, and then we had a few electives that we took. We were either in fine arts or in athletics. But for the most part, some local district or some state prescribed curriculum told you what you were going to take. What we're attempting to do to try to curb this is we're trying to engage students who are more likely to not enroll in college or more likely to not engage in high school so that they're going to college. As an example, in Alief, over the last 5 years, anywhere from 60 to 61% of every graduating class, 6 out of 10 of those graduates enroll in some form of higher ed. Community college, junior college, 4-year, public, private, in-state, out-of-state, doesn't matter. That means 40% aren't. And that 60% is about 3% higher than the state average. So that's not bad relative to the state. What we're attempting to do with pathways, credentials, certifications in meaningful workforce areas is we're trying to build programs and facilities and support for students who, for whatever reason, are not going to go to some form of higher ed as we know it, but they need additional education after high school in something. And so in Alief, we're building a $60 million facility as we sit here today that's going to deal with jobs, certifications, credentials, things for students when they leave our system. They are on the way into some meaningful career if that's what they choose to do. It's going to require more education, but we're giving them a start in that area. So we're pumping a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, as are a lot of districts, into this notion of if you're not interested in going to college and you're 16 years old and you're sitting in the back of an Algebra 2 class, bored out of your mind, wondering why am I doing this, then we're trying to put them in classes where they're working with their hands and they're applying this, what they should be learning or would be learning in a classroom, they're applying it. And oh, by the way, there's a credential or a certification at the end of this experience that is kind of launching you forward into the real workforce.
So this is designed to address the 40%.
It's exactly what it is.
And they're like the lost children.
In my opinion, and I was a part of it. I think we did public ed, Alief in particular, did a really, really good job with this 60% who are going to college. Because we've got data on that 60%, and they do quite well. We were dumping the 40% into the economy or into our society with a high school diploma, and in many cases, nothing else. No skills, no trades, nothing to offer. And it's taken our state, in my opinion, and I want to refer back to my derelict comment because this is where I don't use that term lightly. I think the state of Texas was derelict in not recognizing that we have a segment of our population that we are not utilizing their productivity, the opportunity for them to be productive in our economy. And we were just counting on every kid going to college, and we define success as if you're going to college. And if you go to U of H, you're really successful. And if you go to MIT, you're really, really successful. When we all know that our economy is driven by other forms of workforce, and we were ignoring that as a state.
We also know, Gary, you probably know it as well in the Bel Air school districts even, that
It's HISD.
HISD,
got
that
their
it's
issues.
mostly minority students. Probably at the 80-90%, with a heavier weight of African Americans to Hispanics. A woman named Nicole Hannah Jones, MacArthur Grant recipient, conducted a study. It wasn't of HISD or Alief, but said that what was going on was keeping these students down was that they were being zoned by race. They were the trustee positions were zoned, were gerrymandered by race, and in order to keep them in ghetto areas. And her comment in the story that I read about it was that it's being done that way because that's the way the white people want it done. Your positions on the influence of gerrymandered school districts?
I'll tell you my position. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't think it's true. I mean, yes, we have gerrymandered school board seats because we have the Voting Rights Act and we have to protect minority-majority districts. But what that creates is parochial interest. My guess would be, Superintendent, you'd much prefer a board elected, if it was you were in charge of everything, elected at large that took a look at the whole district as opposed to looking at individual parts of your district. Because you have to deal with the big picture. You're not getting any help there. So I think David's just kind of offset. I mean, the fact is, we shouldn't be surprised we have majority-minority school districts. We live in a majority-minority county now. That's how it is. What I would like to ask instead, David.
By the way, that Jones was not me who wrote this.
I'm sure, but you cited it.
She was a MacArthur Grant winner in that study, finding that there's gerrymandered districts, and attendance is used to make the districts
But
work
our schools have
the
magnet
way.
schools. They have magnet schools. You can apply. You can go outside your district. The problem, education-wise, as you pointed out, is right on. The 60%, the kids who are going to college, that's your sweet spot. You can hammer that all day. To your credit, you and your colleagues who are doing this are now looking at how to deal with the underserved 40%. And then Carol, which I thought was just brilliant, is talking about where we lose a lot of these kids because they're lost in early education because they come from families, to be quite honest, are incapable of educating their children. They just can't because they were never educated. I mean, I see that because as part of my law practice, I do CPS cases, Child Protective Services. So I see some of the kids who are victims of parents who just can't cut it. And it's really sad because there's kids that are really bright, and you kind of think of the story, if your child had been raised by folks like me or you or any of those, as opposed to this mother that has all these issues and can't handle it, kid would have done just fine. Likewise, if my special needs son had been raised by her and not us, he'd be in jail. There's no question about it. So that is what's so very important about what we do. And the other issue I want to throw out, we ask our schools to do so much. I mean, we really do. You're feeding, I don't know what percent you feed breakfast and lunch to because they're inadequately, they don't get nutrition. And that's really, obviously, you don't have nutrition, you can't learn. But you go back, when we went to school, that didn't happen. I mean, yes, school lunches were cheap, but they weren't free. I mean, all these things going on we throw at you. And then, of course, the metal detectors and the police. I mean, we didn't have a police force.
I'm sure there's a question
in our
in there
district.
somewhere.
There is. It's talking about how the world has changed, and which creates a challenge. So, which brings me to
How has the world changed?
my question was, why are we not focusing on student achievement? You mentioned money. We need to spend more money. And indeed, you may be right that that's one of the things we need to do to be successful. But why aren't we focusing, and maybe your groups do, focus on how students perform and what it takes to make sure they can perform?
Well, I think something that, in terms of student achievement, when we look at the bottom 50 elementary schools across Harris County, they're majority comprised of Hispanic and African American students. And every year, Children at Risk, we rank and rate schools. We identify schools that are high performing despite having high levels of poverty. More than 75% of students economically disadvantaged. There are 522 of those schools in the state of Texas, 88 here in Harris County. The feedback that we always get in the question is, oh, well, those schools must be poor, but not as poor or not as challenging as some of these schools that are in the bottom 50. We mapped out those schools. There are schools literally with the same type of students. One has a D or an F in our school ratings. One has an A or a B. So the question is, what is happening in that building that is different and is leading to different outcomes in terms of student achievement, that it happens to be right next to a school that is low performing? So yes, money is certainly not the only answer. It is part of the solution. But even if you throw all the money at a school, you still need a lot of conditions and a lot of quality factors there in order to bring up that
So the
student
things
achievement.
you have found in your studies of what makes these schools that have a student population that comes from poverty be very successful, are there lessons you can learn that you can teach others so they could be successful too?
Yeah, sure, and I'm sure Superintendent Chambers knows this even very well, much better than me. But if you visit these schools, there are some things that are very obvious. Usually, there's an outstanding principal. There's a group of teachers that are very well trained, qualified, believe in the leadership of the school. You can just sense the student and the teacher culture. They have the resources that they need in order to provide instruction. They know how to use data well, and they don't succumb to a culture of testing. Some of them do, but some of them don't, and that is very important.
And the legislature is important. Carol, you can tell us, I think, probably what your policy priorities were for the 85th legislative session, and also tell us what was the most contentious issue that they faced and either were successful in or failing in.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had one issue that we worked very hard on last session, and that was to raise the issue of the number of children in early childhood classrooms. It's called the teacher-to-child ratio. And for young children, obviously, who are learning how to talk, who are needing that interaction. In fact, teacher-to-child or adult-to-child interaction is the most important indicator of whether or not a child is going to be ready for kindergarten, is the quality of that interaction. So our focus was on trying to get a study done, just a study done. We weren't necessarily even recommending what new ratios should be, but we wanted, because we had done locally, we had done a study that looked at ratios and then also looked at injury rates in child care centers. And so we knew in our 13 county area that when centers only put in place the state mandated ratios, there was a 40% higher injury rate than centers that voluntarily had better ratios in place, fewer children per adults. And so when we presented this to the state, they said, we need to do a study at the state level as well. And then there was a change in leadership, and so the study had started and then it was canceled. And so we really wanted to say, this is important. When we have this kind of data in a large community like Houston, we need to find out if this is true across the state. And it was not successful. It was not approved just to get the study done. So that was a big disappointment for us.
We shouldn't forget Harvey, and having been, and you were really hit hard in Alief. And Andy, I know you've taken a survey of HISD and the damages done there. How do you both size up the impact of Harvey in terms of lost performance, lost kids in classrooms? In HISD, they're lost 4 schools.
I don't know that we're going to know the true impact of Harvey for the next couple years, both on the student academic performance side, on the emotional side. In Alief, we were impacted, but not to the extent other districts were. There were some districts that were impacted far worse than we were, with facilities and families and residential. I will say this, and this is going to tie back into a little bit about this conversation about student performance and what's impacting it, and what are some things we can glean from those who are being fairly successful. I think the number one issue that prevents a little boy or a little girl or a young man or a young lady from truly leaving high school with a meaningful opportunity, there's 2 things. One is early childhood. Are they literate by the 3rd grade? In other words, can they read and write functionally at the 3rd grade? And are they numeracy literate? Can they add, subtract, multiply, divide, etc.? The other thing, which few of us have control over, is mobility. It's the movement of children from one place of residence to another, whether it's multifamily, whether it's renting a house. And it doesn't matter whether they move from one of my elementary schools to another one of my elementary schools. The mere fact that particularly our youngest ones, the mere fact they're moving, that is has a dramatic impact on student performance, not to mention the emotional. And I think as a city, as a region, as we look at what are we doing, what is happening that's harming and preventing the ability for children to be literate in numeracy and literacy by third grade, or to find ways in which to graduate with a meaningful opportunity, not just for college, but for the workforce. We have got to figure out a way to slow down children moving, just mom and dad picking up and leaving and moving from one apartment complex to the next.
We've got to figure out a way to expand the number of minutes we have for our program, because we're done. Thank you, Superintendent Chambers, Carol Shattuck, Andy Canales. Appreciate it, and see us next week on Red, White, and Blue.